Hi, my name is Melanie Vincent. I am in GPE 4700's 2020 thesis class, and I will be discussing my research today, which looks at collective land claims as strategies of limited recognition. In my research, I hope to answer how do Canadian colonial strategies of limited recognition present themselves in the processes and outcomes of the 26 completed comprehensive land claim agreements, and to what extent does the CLC framework facilitate economic ordering? So I will be diving into a bit more what those terms mean within that question. But for now, that research question falls under the umbrella of colonialism. And there's two main fields that look at colonialism in Canada today. The first of which is post-colonialism, the study of ways colonialism continues to shape former colonies, and settler colonial theory, which is built off of perceived inadequacies of post-colonialism, the main one of which is the failure to distinguish between classic colonies versus settler colonies. And they believe this analytical distinction is a crucial thing to look at because it creates a dissimilarity between the relational systems that are established. And this distinct stance creates different possibilities for analysis, as well as different conditions of power structures and patterns of relationships. So settler colonialism considers the colonial state as a social political structure rather than a past event. The state requires continued acquisition of territory to facilitate capitalist growth, and this is especially applicable to Canada, which is a staples economy. Colonial Western ideologies are naturalized and perpetuated by the state, and state power circulates through and benefits from formal lawmaking and law executing channels. A large aspect of this is the logic of elimination, and this is the idea that the state requires violent dispossession, displacement, and assimilation to acquire territory. Now, today, Canada is a liberal democratic state, and this constrains the government's ability to outwardly dispossess and assimilate Indigenous peoples. While some argue this makes the logic of elimination outdated, my research is aligned with the argument that the logic of elimination is still embedded in state structures, but it's simply taken a different form. Now, this form is best described by Glenn Coulthard's theory of limited recognition. And the idea that settler colonial states reproduce inequality through a set of discourses and institutional practices that emphasize the recognition and accommodation of Indigenous peoples. Regardless of this discourse, the relationship remains colonial to its foundation, so the progressive liberal nature is simply a facade. And Aboriginal law reproduces colonialism through an asymmetrical exchange of mediated forms of state recognition. Therefore, modern land claims facilitate this state dispossession via the continuation of primitive accumulation. Comprehensive land claims are the modern treaty process through which Canada negotiates with Aboriginal groups that have not previously signed an agreement. It was implemented following the 1973 Calder case, which established Aboriginal title as a legitimate right within Canada's legal system. It provides a comprehensive list of all the rights and lands a group receives upon signing, and thus far 26 claims have been completed. There are hundreds in the negotiation process, and the average amount of time it takes to complete an agreement is 13 and a half years. Next, looking at Aboriginal law. While there's many different ways it's studied, there's a general consensus that centering law and legality within settler colonial studies is very important because it actively channels power structures between state, settler, and Indigenous peoples. So the legal framework is employed as a tool to maintain settler colonial power. And the most common way this is looked at is through the idea of legal consciousness. And this studies how local and individual perceptions of the law are created, maintained, and evolve over time. And there's an emphasis on how they're legitimated and delegitimated through a society. So one example of studies surrounding this is how perceptions are shaped by media representation of Indigenous issues. And another one is actually what I was hoping to look at originally in my research, which is how interpretations of moderate livelihood and conservation affect conflict between Mi'kmaq peoples and commercial fishermen in Nova Scotia. When I looked further into this, I did come across some challenges, namely that this approach lends itself to smaller studies, very regional and anthropological methodologies. And because of this, the data available to me was very limited. And for those situations where there was data, I found that unfortunately, my question had already been answered. So I considered shifting my research question, but maintaining that case study. but I didn't find a question I was really passionate about, so I decided to go back to the drawing board. Next is socio-legal studies, and there's considerable analysis dedicated to examining how the state circumvents its legal obligations to Indigenous people. So there we'll be looking at constitutional interpretation, how there's privatization regimes on reserve land, or historical analysis of evolutions of principles in historical law. Next is a law and political economy framework. And this is where my research falls, and it's an examination into how law creates, reproduces, and protects political economic power, for whom and with what results. So current legal scholarship naturalizes and depoliticizes the law by presenting the legal system as an objective and neutral force. So law and political economy tries to draw back that illusion and look at how law actually structures channels of economic power. It also very commonly employs a historical materialist understanding, which it believes is crucial to looking at the context of how a framework of law came into place. So it's in this framework that economic ordering is looked at. And this is the concept that law creates and enforces the terms of the distribution of wealth. Economic ordering is adjusted and enforced most notably through the creation and maintenance of capitalist markets, but it also involves determining who is subject to market regulations and who receives protections. In the context of my research, it'll involve mapping the techniques which render land a source of credit and results in the historical dispossession of native land. So going back to my question, how do Canadian colonial strategies of limited recognition present themselves in the comprehensive land claims that have been completed? And how does this facilitate the law's economic ordering? So I'm going to cut this section, or this question, into 3 sections. The first of which is historical context. So I believe it's really important to look at the evolution of the land claims process. And this will be done by looking at hallmark Aboriginal title cases, such as Calder v. British Columbia, Delgamu v. British Columbia, etc. And the first of these established Aboriginal title as legitimate, the second defined it, and the third was the first time that a group was granted Aboriginal title. Next, I plan to look at the process, as said in my research question, and I define this as the time frame from the initiation of the claim to the final agreement. So my data I plan to look at is framework agreements, agreements in principle, federal and provincial policy guides, and for about a quarter of the cases, there are ethnographic accounts and negotiation transcripts. If I find common themes, I will incorporate those. However, I will need to be careful considering they aren't available for all the cases. Finally, there are the outcomes, and this is the finished agreement and economic outcomes for affected groups. So this would be final agreements and post-agreement annual reports. For methodology, I plan to do largely a qualitative analysis of modern treaties and government policy, and I'm looking at doing this by combining features of historical materialist policy analysis and critical discourse analysis. So there is a scholar who has implemented a framework I'm planning on imitating. However, I am going to consult texts that focus on each one on their own, and I will adjust if necessary. And of course, I'm planning to draw out the recurring themes within these texts. So economic ordering, I understand in itself, is fairly vague. But there's several things I'll be looking for in these texts to locate evidence of economic ordering. For example, are there clear concessions made by either party between the first agreement and the final agreement? And do the agreements tend to impose economic limitations, or are there limitations to how the land can be used? Does the agreement make it easier or more difficult for resource extraction projects to occur? So especially looking at those up north, is there a pattern between our mining industries helped or hindered? And yeah, furthermore, are any specific industries helped or hindered by the results of the claim in general? So that is how I hope to answer my question, and I'm very much excited to dive into the theory and the methodology aspect of my research. Thank you so much for listening.